Hello, folks. Welcome. Thrice welcome to JWC Livestream. This is Joe's Writers Club Livestream. JWC Sublimated Poesy with Ricky and David. This is the poetry show. Thursday is the prose, we're talking creativity show. This is a show where we talk about poesy, which is the writing of poetry and poetry itself, and also the concept of poetic voice fulfillment. Language play, voice fulfillment, and what the difference is between the two. Last week, I thought we brought you a pretty decent piece of content with the subtle, haunting, gross haunting thing. I was very pleased with that because of what it demonstrates. And that's what we're all about, is demonstrating that type of creativity. I'm Ricky, the one half of the duo. The other half of the duo is here. His name is David Anderson. He's a poet. He's an excellent writer. David, are you there? Come forth.
Yes, I am here.
Excellent. We wouldn't have it any other way. So I have been working on 2 books. I'm writing a sci-fi book called Chirum 6, or Chronicles of Chirum. Still figuring that out. Having a blast with that. Right on the cusp of being exactly halfway through with it. And I'm writing another book, certainly not to be de-emphasized. It's Athenaeum or Athenaeum. I'm really bad at pronouncing the title. But it is an amazing mythical fantasy story that I'm writing with good old David here. And I'm literally having a blast. Like every other chapter is like literally thrilling to compose. And the overall project looks majestic. It looks like it's going to be really special. And I'm glad of that, man. Creativity. The transcendent force of creativity. I mean, without it, we live in such a crazy world. I don't know what I would do without it. I'm very, very grateful to the powers that be, and such. But in this particular case, when it comes down to creativity, we're also about sharing what's going on, so that people can further their process and learn. And that includes us too. David, how have you been lately, and how's your creativity, your creative life going?
I've been fine. Of course, been working on Athenaeum, and I'm outlining a second novel called Billy, which is sort of a murder/ghost story, and it looks to be very promising. And there's a second novel that also involves a haunting, or for some reason I'm moving towards haunting stories, that's set in a southern town, and it involves a college professor after she buys a house in an old farmhouse that is haunted. So it involves some narrative or structural tricks like that involve a purchase of a mirror, a full-length mirror that is bought and put back into the house that the previous owners had, and it initiates a haunting.
Oh man, sounds great.
Yes.
Haunted body length mirrors, haunted farms.
Yes.
Ghoulish, shadowy countryside.
Right.
It sounds tasty. You put lots of layers of mood over the top of that. give us some good expo, some craziness. And again, employing the techniques that we were speaking of last week. Please do check it out. Subtle haunting, gross haunting, to build tension, to build mystery, to build uncertainty. I certainly will like to read those, David, with the voice fulfillment you have and what you're capable of. Those should be real tasty. So that sounds fantastic. Both of us got that going, and it's really important as the storms of this life keep raging. But you know, we come together because of the nature of creativity, and we want to talk about the muse, which is an extension of what inspires us. Today's episode is definitely you know, circling around that is inspiration. Because of this particular duo we have, as you know, we read a poem and then we read a prose piece. And optimally, these things complement each other while teaching us something. Well, in this particular case, we're doing the Robert Browning poem, Child Roland to the Dark Tower Came. Now, anyone who's familiar with this piece of inspiration, because it's a wild, awesome poem all by itself. But what is known for certain is that Stephen King, the great writer, the great horror writer, Stephen King, mentioning horror, he wrote his huge Dark Tower series. It was, according to himself, or at least this is what I heard, it was inspired by this poem. So it's the real question of what is inspiration? And when it strikes the creative, how best to utilize it, and don't let it, it's like inspiration is an opportunity, and you can't let it go to waste. You have to strike while the iron's hot. And I would imagine, because the way he talks about, because I listen to when Stephen King gives lectures and such, when he talks, he almost always has something helpful to say, but it seems very one-to-one as far as, well, this is when I thought of the mist, and this is when I thought of the Dark Tower. And he seems to remember those flashes, those bolts of inspiration. So he read this poem at some point during his life, and he came up with the Dark Tower. And you can kind of see how that's possible. Thank you for sharing the screen, David. So I'm going to read this. I'm going to read this poem, and let's see if we can look into it as a piece of inspiration, the way that it struck him with a muse. So this is Child Roland to the Dark Tower Came by Robert Browning. My first thought was, he lied in every word, that hoary cripple with malicious eye, askance to watch the working of his lie on mine, and mouth scarce able to afford suppression of the glee that pursed and scored its edge at one more victim gained thereby. What else should he be set for with his staff? What, save to waylay with his lies and snare all travelers who might find him posted there, and ask the road? I guessed what skull-like laugh would break, what crunching right of epitaph for pastime in the dusty thoroughfare. If at his counsel I should turn aside into that ominous track which, all agree, hides the Dark Tower, yet acquiescingly I did turn as he pointed, neither pride nor hope rekindling at the end descried, so much as gladness that some end might be. For what with my whole worldwide wandering, What with my search drawn out through years, my hope dwindled into a ghost not fit to cope with that obstreperous joy success would bring. I hardly tried now to rebuke the spring. My heart made finding failure in its scope. As when a sick man very near to death seems dead indeed, and feels begin and end, the tears and takes the farewell of each friend, and hears one bid the other go, draw breath, freelier outside, since all is o'er, he saith, and the blow fallen no grieving can amend. While some discuss if near the other graves be room enough for this, and when a day suits best for carrying the corpse away, with care about the banners, scarves, and staves, and still the man hears all, and only craves he may not shame such tender love and stay. Thus I had so long suffered in this quest, heard failure prophesied so oft, been writ so many times among the band, to which the knights who to the dark tower's search addressed their steps, that just to fail as they seemed best, and all the doubt was now, should I be fit? So quiet as despair I turned from him, that hateful cripple, out of his highway, into the path appointed. All the day had been a dreary one at best, and a dim was settling to its close, yet shot one grim red leer to see the plain catch its astray. For no sooner was I fairly found, pledged to the plain after a pace or two, then pausing to throw backward a last view o'er the safe road. 'Twas gone, gray, plain all around. Nothing but plain to the horizon's bound. I might go on, naught else remained to do. So on I went. I think I never saw such starved, ignoble nature. Nothing throve, for flowers as well expected a cedar grove. A cockle spurge, according to their law, might propagate their kind with none to awe. You'd think a burr had been a treasure trove. No, penury, inertness, and grimace, in the strange sort, were the land's portion. See or shut your eyes, said nature peevishly. It's nothing, skills, I cannot help my case. 'Tis the last judgment's fire must cure this place, calcine its clods and set my prisoners free. If there pushed any ragged thistle stalk above its mates, the head was chopped, the bents were jealous else. What made those holes and rents in the dock's harsh and swarth leaves, bruised as to balk all hope of greenness? 'Tis a brute must walk pashing their life out with a brute's intents. As for the grass, it grew as scant as hair and leprosy. Thin dry blades pricked the mud, which underneath looked kneaded up with blood. One stiff, blind horse, his every bone a stare, stood stupefied. However he came there, thrust out past service from the devil's stud. Alive? He might be dead for aught I know. With that red, gaunt, and calloped neck astrain, shut eyes underneath the rusty mane, seldom went such grotesqueness with such woe. I never saw a brute I hated so. He must be wicked to deserve such pain. I shut my eyes and turn them on my heart, as a man calls for wine before he fights. I asked one drought of earlier, happier sights. At 50, I could hope to play my part. Think first, fight afterwards, the soldier's art. One taste of the old time sets all to rights. Not it, I fancied Cuthbert's reddening face beneath its garniture of curly gold. Dear fellow, till I almost felt him fold an arm in mine to fix me to that place. That way he used, alas, one night's disgrace. Out went my heart's new fire and left it cold. Giles then, the soul of honor, there he stands, frank as 10 years ago when knighted first. What honest man should dare, he said, he durst, good, but the scene shifts, faugh. What hangman hands pinned to his breast the parchment? His own bands read it, poor traitor, spit upon and cursed. Better this present than a past like that. Back therefore to my darkening path again. No sound, no sight, as far as eye could strain. Will the night send a howlet of a bat? I asked when something on the dismal flat came to arrest my thoughts and change their train. A sudden little river crossed my path, and as unexpected as serpent comes, as a serpent comes. No sluggish tide congenial to the glooms. This, as it frothed by, might have been a bath for the fiend's glowing hoof, to see the wrath of its black eddy bespake with flakes and spumes. So pretty yet so spiteful all along, low scrubby alders kneeled down over it. Drenched willows flung them headlong in a fit of mute despair, a suicidal throng, river which had done them all the wrong. Whatever that was, rolled by, deterred no wit. Which while I forged, good saints, how I feared to set my foot upon a dead man's cheek. Each step, or feel the spear I thrust to seek, for hollows tangled in his hair or beard. May have been a water rat I speared, but ugh, it sounded like a baby's shriek. Glad was I when I reached the other bank for a better country. Vain presage. Who were the strugglers? What war did they wage? Whose savage trample thus could pad the dank soil to a plash? Toads in a poison tank, or wildcats in a red-hot iron cage? Fight must so have seemed in that fell cirque. What penned them there, with all the plain to choose? No footprint leading to that horrid news. None out of it. Mad brewage set to work, their brains, no doubt, like galley slaves, the Turk pits for his pastime, Christians against Jews. And more than that, a furlong on, why there? What bad use was that engine for, that wheel or brake or not wheel, that harrow to fit to reel? Men's bodies out Ike's silk with all the air of Tuffet's tool on earth left unaware, or brought to sharpen its rusty teeth of steel. Then came a bit of stubbed ground, once a wood, next a marsh, it would seem, and now mere earth, desperate and done with, so a fool finds mirth, makes a thing and then mars it, till his mood changes and off he goes. Within a rude bog clay and rubble, sand and stark black dearth, now blotches rankling, colored, gay and grim, now patches where some leanness of the soils broke into moss or substances like thus. Then came some palsied oak, a cleft in him like a distorted mouth that splits its rim, gaping at death, and dies while it recoils. Just as far as ever from the end, not in the distance, but the evening, not to point my footstep further. At the thought, a great black bird, Apollyon's bosom friend, sailed past, nor beat his wide-winged dragon penned, that brushed my cap, perchance the guide I sought. For looking up, aware I somehow grew, spite of the dusk, the plain had given place all round to mountains, with such name to grace. Mere ugly heights and heaps now stolen in view. How thus they had surprised me, solve it you? How to get from them was no clearer case. Yet half I seemed to recognize some trick or of mischief happened to me, God knows when. And a bad, perhaps, here ended then progress this way, when in the very nick of giving up, one more time came a click, as when a trap shuts, you're inside the den. Burningly it came on me all at once. This was the place, those two hills on the right, couched like two bulls locked horn in horn and fight. While to the left, a tall scalped mountain, dunce, dotard, a dozing at the very nonce, after a life spent training for the sight. What in the midst lay but the tower itself, the round squat turret, blind as the fool's heart, built of brown stone without a counterpart in the whole world. Tempest's mocking elf points to the shipman, thus the unseen shelf. He strikes on only when the timbers start. Not see? Because of night, perhaps? Why day came back for that? Before it left, the dying sunset kindled through a cleft. The hills, like giants at a hunting, lay chin upon hand to see the game at bay. Now stab and end the creature. To the heft. Not here, when noise was everywhere, told, increasing like a bell, names in my ears of all the lost adventures, my peers. How such a one was strong, and such was bold, and such was fortunate, yet each of old, lost, one moment knelled the woe of years. There they stood, ranged along the hillsides, met to view the last of me, a living frame, for one more picture in a sheet of flame. I saw them, and I knew them all, and yet dauntless, the slug horn to my lips I set and blew. Child Roland to the dark tower came. Well, that's an interesting poem. All over the place, really. I don't exactly know what to make of it. And I don't know what fondness or repetition led Stephen King to see his muse through it. I'm kind of searching. I find that when you see a muse in something like this, sometimes it almost happens by mistake. Sometimes there's some sort of misapprehension or something. And it takes your mind down a direction that you would never have imagined. I've had things like that. Sometimes images, sometimes a word will be on a page singled out, or a combination of words or something from a story. And then all this stuff comes into my head. But I don't see it here. What did you think of the read, David? And what do you think of the poem?
I think that was a fair reading of the poem. I have I made some notes in preparation. I went back and
Excellent, excellent.
yes, I went back and reviewed. I studied this when I was an undergrad, and it was a long time ago, so I had to go back and find my copy of it in my collection and the notes that I found. And I had a professor who was a big fan of Browning, and she gave me some notes on the structure and how it can be interpreted. And I have my own view, which is not commonly spoke of in literature, and that's that I think it's a nod to A Knight's Tale, like in King Arthur, and that would tie everything together in a very coherent way if you think of it as if he were a knight of the round table and he's headed off to this challenge. If he defeats this dreaded enemy in the tower, that we don't have a complete description of, but I do assume that it's something close to like a dragon, perhaps, or a serpent, or some horrible beast that no man has been able to succeed against. Or we can also look at it from the point of view of the story of St. George slaying the dragon. So that's one way of a general interpretation, if you want. It's a hero's journey. But it's very surrealistic in its presentation.
Yes.
And it uses dreamlike surrealism, and it sort of plays with the time and flow of activity a bit. So as he's going through across this, what is very much a sort of hellish landscape of former battlefields, I think our Tolkien friends might think of the Dead Marshes, for example.
Yeah, right on.
Right. So you have all of the corpses and the former fallen heroes and warriors who attempted this great task and failed. And he is witnessing them and encountering them on the way. And you have the grim and grisly figure, the old man at the beginning of the poem, who points him in the direction, and he feels a sense of unease. The man knows his fate. And I have to say, the fate isn't a happy ending. I don't think that he succeeds. He falls like all the other warriors before him. And that brings us into two ways of now analyzing the poems in a more classic way and formal way. We can analyze it as a nightmare. So it represents a sort of decline into a despair. So the hero is losing his courage and his confidence that he will succeed in his task. And then there's a more modern, which is existential victory, which is throwing yourself into hell itself, knowing that you'll not come back from hell. And you're sacrificing yourself, much like Camus claims that Sisyphus is sacrificing himself in this fruitless task. So there's a kind of cessation of life. So you have a victory over the suffering of life, but you have to make a great sacrifice. And the greatest sacrifice any individual can make, of course, is sacrificing their life to a cause. There are other, we can get into the text and break it apart, but we do have the Stephen King text to go through. But those are like sort of the highlights of how you could begin to open it up. But I really think it does sort of make a nod at sort of like a knight's quest.
No, I'm forced to agree, and I very much value how you elucidated that point because there is something in what Stephen King has brought to the gunslinger, where the gunslingers are like they're like an order of knights. And how is the Dark Tower not comparable to the Holy Grail? You know,
Exactly, precisely.
um, yeah. So I see what you're talking about there. It's just recoded into Americana, but yeah, that's very sharp, man. That's cool you pointed that out. um I'm sure our audience appreciates it too, because there's something mysterious about that poem. Like it needs some clarity. So being that the show's about inspiration, it's well known that the Dark Tower series was inspired by this poem that we just read. And we're dwelling on inspiration. So as we read this first chapter of The Gunslinger, which is the first book in the Dark Tower series, I read it. I dug it. We're gonna let's take a look and see if we can find the muse here from that poem. So this is chapter 1 of The Gunslinger by Stephen King. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. The desert was the apotheosis of all deserts, huge, standing to the sky for what looked like eternity in all directions. It was white and blinding and waterless and without feature save for the faint, cloudy haze of the mountains, which sketched themselves on the horizon, and the devil grass, which brought sweet dreams, nightmares, death. An occasional tombstone sign pointed the way. For once, the drifted track that cut its way through the thick crust of alkali had been a highway. Coaches and buckus had followed it. The world had moved on since then. The world had emptied. The gunslinger had been struck by a momentary dizziness, a kind of yawning sensation that made the entire world seem ephemeral, almost a thing that could be looked through. It passed, and like the world upon whose hide he walked, he moved on. He passed the miles stolidly, not hurrying, not loafing. A hide water bag was slung around his middle like a bloated sausage. It was almost full. He had progressed through the Kef over many years and had reached perhaps the 5th level. Had he been a manny holy man, he might not have been thirsty. He could have watched his own body dehydrate with clinical, detached attention, watering its crevices and dark inner hollows only when his logic told him it must be done. He was not a manny, however, not a follower of the man Jesus, and considered himself in no way holy. He was just an ordinary pilgrim. In other words, and all he could say with real certainty was that he was thirsty. And even so, he had no particular urge to drink. In a vague way, all this pleased him. It was what the country required. It was a thirsty country. And he had in his long life been nothing if not adaptable. Below the water bag were his guns, carefully weighted to his hands. A plate had been added to each when they had come to him from his father, who had been lighter and not so tall. The 2 belts crisscrossed above his crotch. The holsters were oiled too deeply for even this Philistine's son to crack. The stocks of the guns were sandalwood, yellow, and finely grained. Rawhide tie-downs held the holsters loosely to his thighs, and they swung a bit with his step. They had rubbed away the bluing of his jeans and thinned the cloth, and a pair of arcs that looked almost like smiles. The brass casings of the cartridges looped into the gun belts, heliographed in the sun. There were fewer now. The leather made subtle creaking noises. His shirt, the no color of rain or dust, was open at the throat, with a rawhide thong dangling loosely and hand-punched eyelets. His hat was gone. So was the horn he had once carried. Gone for years, that horn, spilled from the hand of a dying friend, and he missed them both. Breasted a gently rising dune. Although there was no sand here, the desert was hard pan, and even the harsh winds that blew when dark came raised only an aggravating harsh dust like scourging powder, and saw the kicked remains of a tiny campfire on the lee side, the side the sun would quit earliest. Small signs like this, once more affirming the man in black's possible humanity, never failed to please him. His lips stretched in the pitted, flaked remains of his face. The grin was gruesome, painful. He squatted. His quarry had burned the devil grass, of course. It was the only thing out here that would burn. It burned with a greasy, flat light, and it burned slow. Border dwellers had told him that devils lived even in the flames. They burned it, but would not look into the light. They said the devils hypnotized, beckoned, would eventually draw the one who looked into the fires. The next man foolish enough to look into the fire might see you. The burned grass was crisscrossed in the now familiar ideographic pattern and crumbled to gray senselessness before the gunslinger's prodding hand. There was nothing in the remains but a charred scrap of bacon, which he ate thoughtfully. It had always been this way. The gunslinger had followed the man in black across the desert for 2 months now, across the endless, screamingly monotonous purgatorial wastes, and had yet to find spoor other than the hygienic, sterile ideographs of the man in black's campfires. He had not found a can, a bottle, or a water bag. The gunslinger had left 4 of those behind like dead snakeskins. He hadn't found any dung. He assumed the man in black buried it. Perhaps the campfires were a message, spelled out one great letter at a time. Keep your distance, partner, it might say, or the end draweth nigh. Or maybe even come and get me. It didn't matter what they said or didn't say. He had no interest in messages, if messages they were. What mattered was that these remains were as cold as all the others, yet he had gained. He knew he was closer, but did not know he knew. Kind of smell, perhaps, that didn't matter. It didn't matter either. He would keep going until something changed, and if nothing changed, he would keep going anyway. There would be water if God willed it, the old timers said. Water if God willed it, even in the desert. The gunslinger stood up, brushing his hands. No other trace. The wind, razor sharp, had of course filed away even what scant tracks the hard pan might once have held. No manscat, no cast-off trash, never a sign of where those things might have been buried. Nothing. Only these cold campfires along the ancient highway, moving southeast, and the relentless rangefinder in his own head. Although, of course, it was more than that. The pull southeast was more than just a sense of direction, it was even more than magnetism. He sat down and allowed himself a short pull from the water bag. He thought of that momentary dizziness earlier in the day, that sense of being almost untethered from the world, and wondered what it might have meant. Why should that dizziness make him think of his horn and the last of his old friends, both lost so long ago at Jericho Hill? He still had the guns, his father's guns, and surely they were more important than horns or even friends, weren't they? The question was oddly troubling, but since there seemed to be no answer but the obvious one, he put it aside, possibly for later consideration. He scanned the desert and then looked up at the sun, which was now sliding into a far quadrant of the sky that was disturbingly not quite true west. He got up, moved his threadbare gloves from his belt, and began to pull devil grass for his own fire, which he laid over the ashes the man in black had left. He found the irony, like his thirst, bitterly appealing. He did not take the flint and steel from his purse until the remains of the day were only fugitive heat in the ground beneath him and a sardonic orange line on the monochrome horizon. He sat with his gun drawn across his lap and watched the southeast patiently, looking toward the mountains, not hoping to see the thin straight line of smoke from a new campfire, not expecting to see an orange spark of flame, but watching anyway because watching was a part of it and had its own bitter satisfaction. You will not see what you do not look for, maggot, Court would have said. Open the gobs the gods gave you, will you not? But there was nothing. He was close, but only relatively so. Not close enough to see smoke at dusk or the orange wink of a campfire. He laid the flint down the steel rod and struck his spark to the dry, shredded grass, muttering the old and powerful nonsense words as he did. Spark of dark, where's my sire? Will I lay me? Will I stay me? Bless this camp with fire. It was strange how some childhood words and always fell at the wayside and were left behind, while others clamped tight and rode for life, growing the heavier to carry as time passed. He laid down upwind of his little blazon, letting the dream smoke blow out toward the waste. The wind, except for occasional gyrating dust devils, was constant. Above the stars were unwinking, also constant. Suns and worlds by the million, dizzying constellations, cold fire in every primary hue. As he watched, the sky washed from violet to ebony. A meteor etched a brief, spectacular arc below Old Mother and winked out. Fire through strange shadows as the devil grass burned its slow way down into new patterns. Not ideograms, but a straightforward crisscross, vaguely frightening in its own nonsense surety. He had laid his fuel in a pattern that was not artful, but only workable. It spoke of blacks and whites. It spoke of a man who might straighten bad pictures in strange hotel rooms. The fire burned its steady, slow flame, and phantoms danced in its incandescent core. The gunslinger did not see. Two patterns, art and craft, were welded together as he slept. The wind moaned, a witch with cancer in her belly. Every now and then, a perverse downdraft would make the smoke whirl and puff toward him, and he breathed some of it in. It built dreams in the same way that a small irritant may build a pearl in an oyster. The gunslinger occasionally moaned with the wind. Stars were as indifferent to this as they were to wars, crucifixions, resurrections. This also would have pleased him. So we have that mighty installment. And I can sort of see what's going on as far as the inspiration is concerned, especially if we triangulate it with Arthurian legend. And he is having his mythic exploration of the wilderness desolation of this world, all with great poetic description. Real tasty, I thought. So he's looking for the tower, and he's looking for the man in black, which is the equivalent of a dragon, the tower, a grail. And the ultimate sense of it is that he's questing, he's in pursuit, and he's moving through the wilderness. There's also something sort of biblical about it, as if he's searching for something out in the desert, something that is sort of spiritual, because he's talking about something that's greater than magnetism and greater than all these compelling forces. And I know from my own read of this book that as you go on, he can't stop. The way that Percival couldn't stop until he got the Grail, he has to keep going, and it gets more and more tense. The tension keeps building up. I think it's a fantastic situation of modern myth. I think it combines a bunch of elements. The idea that it's spraying out of that poem is it's very, very cool. Saying nothing, of course, of Roland as a character, which later on, he's just like, ooh. He may be a knight, but not all knights were pure and all this. He is a knight in the way that a knight is driven by convictions and compelled to keep going no matter what once he's taken a vow. A driven man. A man who defies his mortality and pushes his body to the limit. Despite his moral dubiousness, there's still something to be admired. And the quest for the man in black is tantalizing, especially when it all unfolds. A book to read for certain. David, what did you think of that read and the passage itself?
I thought that was a very good read. I think I could also point out that it's a lot like more like St. George and the Dragon. And I can come up with a modern equivalent that the readers may be familiar with, a film called The Dragon Slayer.
Oh yeah, that flick's awesome.
Yes, and in it, the old man, the wizard, makes it clear that the king of those people had made a monstrous contract with the dragon not to destroy the crops of that land if he would sacrifice a young virgin at the beginning of each season. So his comrades that have fallen to the man in black, he could be going after that. That's his dragon, is the man in black.
It seems to fit that mythic architecture
right
nicely. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So it's about righting the wrong of a bad system that before monotheistic religions came along, ritual blood sacrifice was a very common form of religious ritual.
You could say that again.
And it was meant as a contract between humans and the god to appease the gods.
A covenant in blood, yes.
A covenant in blood, precisely.
Yep.
And you can see that in another film, the Wicker Man. That that the sacrifices that they made in the form of fruits and vegetables have not pleased their gods, so they need a virgin sacrifice who's willing to sacrifice himself. And that happens to be the young police officer that comes to investigate the disappearance of a young girl. He's not aware. And I suppose most people would say he is most definitely not willing to go to his death. But as far as the people in that cult are concerned, he's a virgin because he's unmarried. And he resists the temptation of women in the film on several occasions. And so that means he's chaste. So he's a proper sacrifice in blood. So there are a lot of ways you can interpret these stories and ideas. And it's not so important that we get to the truth, but we have fun trying to come up with our own interpretation and how it can inform us of our own experiences in life.
And that is a piece of wisdom to point out. And I think that the ultimate goal is to be inspired by almost everything you see. Because if he was inspired by the poem and that gave him this chapter, now when we read this chapter, we need to be inspired by it the way he was inspired by the poem, and to see everything from a sort of mythic quality or in a mythic light, and take that with us, you know. And it's interesting what you said about sacrifices too, because there is something, no spoiler alert, I won't clarify it, but there is something in this book of that sacrifice that comes later. So I wonder about the hero's journey in this particular story and how well Stephen King knew Campbell, you know, because
I do think that there is a type of hero's journey that does involve sacrifice for a greater cause or a greater good. And a modern interpretation of that, which is not certainly not a religious or traditional interpretation, is that it's the person sacrificing themselves to release themselves from existential horrors of daily life, for example. So
Sure.
A modern reader could take that view if they don't want to look at it through the lens of a classic interpretation of the hero's tale in this particular circumstance. It's entirely up to the reader, of course. So my purpose in presenting all this was to offer people a way to take text. They can do a little research and then they can read the book in the way they choose to. And I'm sure any writer worth their salt will be at peace with that. And I'm sure Stephen King would be at peace with the reader's interpretation of The Dark Tower.
Yes, I think so. And again, this is a call out to all those people out there who have writer's block or who are somehow disenchanted with creativity. Just read and reread and study and look at these texts. You know, that wasn't the first time he read that Dark Tower poem. He read it and he dug it, and then it leapt out at him, and it gave him a muse flash. It gave him inspiration. So
I think it connected him to the hero's journey in a way. It gave him,
yeah.
It gave him a way to create a character that could go on a hero quest.
Yes, without a doubt. And that's the thing, man. Before you start fretting about how you're uninspired, like read, you know, listen to music, read a poem. You never know what it's going to do. You never know how it's going to beautify your life or bring in something new and terrible that you never realized before. That's where the inspiration comes from. It comes from that, just like in the Dark Tower, in the Gunslinger first chapter, where he has that point of dizziness, and then he thinks about his horn and he thinks about his old friends. It's like, you don't know when that lightning's going to strike. You don't know when inspiration is going to hit you. It happens. It happens in a moment like that. And it's the same thing with him. In that case, it was an intrusive memory, but awareness is awareness and consciousness is consciousness. It's a mystery. And best thing to do is to stay out of your own way. That sustained him in his wilderness wandering, in his gloomy quest for this tower and this mysterious man in black. He was able to keep himself occupied and hopefully de-anxietize himself by that terrible fire in that desolate place, a place where he knows some fiend just was. If that's not inspiration, I don't know what is. Well, look, this has been another Sublimated Poesy show, another fine episode. I really, really dig it. We learned something new here about inspiration. We learned, well, make sure you watch where your focus is. Make sure you have mindfulness and you pay attention. So, and take notes, man. There's no doubt that he wrote it down like right away and he kept it. Because you never know when inspiration is going to strike. So thank you. Time flies when you're having fun, as always. The show, I feel like it ends right after it begins. Thank you very much for watching. We as much as we do. Go to joeswritersclub.com. Please go to joeswriters.club. Check out our social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and please do go to our YouTube channel, like and subscribe. The more you help us out, the more we can help other people out. And we're very, very focused and inspired by the transcendent force of creativity. We're regular writers. We write every day. We have a word yield. We're always looking for that next bit of inspiration. Thanks again for joining us. David, as always, it was a pleasure. Thank you for picking this material and clarifying the poem like you did. That was of great value. And thanks for doing the show today.
You're welcome.
Well, folks, off we go. It'll be another week before you know it. Stay creative, everyone, and be well. Take care.